I thank you that you have been brave enough to reach out your hands to the crushed and blighted of my race. I hope from your sad fate, great good may arise to the cause of freedom. I feel it is always necessary to begin each Sunday in February with a reminder that we're in the midst of Black History Month. One can easily get caught up on the injustice of the fact that the contributions of Black Americans, who have spent years being occluded by dominant white culture, are only given recognition during the shortest month of the year. But what pains me every year with the observance of Black History Month is the discovery of so many exemplary Black Americans who are working to do extraordinary things in the confines of a society that literally kept them in bondage and refused to recognize them as being independent people afforded civil rights, that I never learned about or even heard about during my 20 years of education. As painful as it is also a wonderfully fascinating moment that makes me want to shout from the rooftops how it is that we have not heard of these amazing Black Americans and the incredible things that they did and that they achieved. I could spend an entire year of sermons talking about these Black Americans that many of us have never gotten the pleasure to meet. But for today, I'm going to introduce you to one of them. She's not only noteworthy for her accomplishments as a Black woman in the 19th century American society, she's also noteworthy because she was a fellow Unitarian. Her name is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Some of you may be familiar with her story. If you are not, I invite you to get comfortable as I introduce you to this amazing woman. Frances Ellen Watkins was born on September 24th, 1825, to free parents in Baltimore, Maryland, which was still a slave state at the time. She was orphaned at age 3 and was adopted and raised by her maternal aunt and uncle, Henrietta and Reverend William J. Watkins Sr. Reverend Watkins was well known in Baltimore as the minister of Sharp Street African Methodist Episcopal Church, and was an active and tireless civil rights activist and abolitionist who had a profound impact on Frances' life and education. At the age of 13, she began working as a seamstress and also as a nursemaid to a local Quaker family who owned a bookshop, where Frances was able to indulge her great passion for books and reading. She began her writing career at the mere age of 14 in 1839 by publishing a few articles in anti-slavery journals, while she moved from Baltimore to Columbus, Ohio, to teach domestic science at Union Seminary, and then to York, Pennsylvania, where she continued her teaching career. Her first collection of poetry, Forest Leaves or Autumn Leaves, was published in 1845 when she was only 20 years old, making her one of the first Black women in the United States to publish an anthology of poetry. Her second collection, Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, was published in 1854 to much critical acclaim. It would go on to sell many copies and has been reprinted multiple times over the years. She published a short story, The Two Offers, in the Anglo-African newspaper in 1859, becoming the first Black woman in the United States to publish a short story. She would go on to write 3 novels between 1868 to 1888 that were published as magazine serials, in addition to more than 80 poems. She is perhaps best known for her 1872 novel Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, written when she was 67, that addressed issues of education for women, the social passing as white of mixed-race people, miscegenation, abolition, Reconstruction, temperance, and social responsibility. She is also known for a strong legacy of work fighting for both Black civil rights and an advocacy for women's rights, which she often combined together, declaring that the two were not mutually exclusive. For Harper, one could not fight for the rights of Black women alone without first seeking freedom for all enslaved Black people in this country. Sadly, Harper would experience this firsthand with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which made life for Black people in her home state of Maryland nearly impossible. The laws at that time stated that any free person of color that entered into Maryland would be arrested and sold back into slavery. Most of her family escaped to Canada, but Harper chose to stay and move to the Free State of Ohio. According to Polly Peterson, who wrote about Harper's story for the book Stirring the Nation's Heart, 18 Stories of Prophetic Unitarians and Universalists of the 19th Century, Harper heard from friends the story of a Black man who accidentally crossed into Maryland while traveling and was captured and sold to a Georgia slaveholder. He escaped, but was later recaptured and sent back to the Georgia plantation, where he later died. Quote, "Upon that grave, I pledged myself to the anti-slavery cause," declared Harper in a letter to a friend. While Harper began including themes of Black civil rights in her poetry and prose, it was her public speaking and public witness to the cause that she supported to which 19th century Civil War era society took notice. With the acclaim that she received from her published writings, she was invited to numerous speaking engagements and began to make a name for herself on the lecture circuits. In 1854, she gave a public lecture entitled "The Education and the Elevation of the Colored Race" that earned her a full-time job as a traveling lecturer for the State Anti-Slavery Society of Maine. She also gave a keynote address in 1866 at the National Women's Rights Convention entitled "We Are All Bound Up Together," in which her advocacy would take on the characteristic and passionate voice of the Unitarian and Universalist beliefs that she would develop in her later life. Quote, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving the curse of its own soul. In advocating the cause of the colored man, since the Dred Scott decision, I have sometimes said I thought that the nation touched bottom. But let me tell you, there is a depth of infamy lower than that. It is when the nation, standing upon the threshold of a great peril, reached out its hand to a feebler race and asked that race to help it, and when the peril was over said, quote, 'You are good enough for soldiers, but not good enough for citizens.'" She also penned the words from the beginning of the sermon in a letter to the radical abolitionist John Brown, sent after his arrest for the 1859 raid on the U.S. Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and before his execution for treason. The letter was a thank you for his action and for his attempts to do something about the issue of slavery in this country. It was not only the words that she wrote and spoke, but it was the actions that she took that were guided by the beliefs that she held. After moving to Philadelphia in 1858, Harper boarded a segregated streetcar and took a seat in an area reserved solely for white passengers. In spite of the conductor asking her to leave and another passenger trying to intervene and get her to move, Harper stayed in her seat. When she arrived at her destination, she attempted to pay the fare, but the conductor refused to accept her money. Frustrated, she threw the money on the floor of the streetcar and left. Through this act of defiance and insistence of the civil rights for which she was due as a citizen of the United States, Harper would go on to be an inspiration to a new generation of activists who would use sit-ins on public transportation as a tool for activism and social justice. 84 years before Bayard Rustin would be arrested in 1952 for refusing to sit in the colored section of a bus in New York City, and women like Irene Morgan, Lily Mae Bradford, Sarah Louise Keyes, Claudette Colvin, Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, Mary Louise Smith, and of course, Rosa Parks, would use the refusal to move from their seats as a catalyst to help end desegregation once and for all, a legacy which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would see to its eventual conclusion. Though not initially raised in the faith, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper joined the Unitarian Church after moving to Philadelphia, and she and her daughter were active and longtime members of First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia until her daughter's death in 1908, and Frances's death in 1911 at the age of 85. First Unitarian in Philadelphia held her funeral service at the church, a fitting tribute for a woman who had spent so many years advocating for racial equality, women's equality and women's suffrage. Although she passed away 9 years before the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, she did live to see the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which she helped to advocate for, that prevented the federal government and each state from denying or abridging a citizen's rights to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In the great pantheon of prophetic people throughout history, whose words and deeds challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love, we are aware of so many names, both within our Unitarian and Universalist traditions, from whom we draw our inspiration. Yet, there are so many others whose accomplishments have been pushed aside to the margins and lost in the annals of history. Today's sermon has been an attempt to take the example of one of them, one of the few rare examples of a Black female Unitarian voice who fought for racial and social equality during the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, and allow her to have the platform that she has all too often been denied to have. And it is perhaps a small hope of mine that by doing so, it allows us to open the doors to so many others throughout history, our history as a nation and as a people, and look for others whom we should have been telling their stories all along, and allow them to speak and have the opportunity to inform us in how to continue to confront the powers and structures of evil that we seek to eradicate in our own lifetimes. To wherever Mrs. Harper may be watching from the great beyond, thank you for your words and actions. May we continue to remember them, and may we never forget them again. May it ever continue to be so. Blessed be. Amen. Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Thank you all so much.